They say the moon never makes a mistake, but standing in that ballroom, suffocating under the scent of cedar and my sister's jasmine perfume, I knew they were wrong. My fated mate, Alpha Kael, looked me in the eyes and did the unthinkable. He didn't mark me. He rejected me. He called me a broken, wolfless thing and chose my perfect sister instead. Branded a failure, I was dragged to the auction block in iron chains. I expected a life of misery, until the air turned to ice. Alpha Silas, the ruthless Shadow King and Kael's greatest rival, stepped out of the mist. He didn't just bid, he bought my soul for 500 gold pieces. He leaned in close, smelling of frozen rain and ebony, and whispered, "I didn't buy you to save you, little wolf. I bought you to burn their world to the ground." Kael thought he sold a defect. Silas thinks he bought a weapon. But they're both wrong, because the wolfless Omega is about to wake up, and she's a goddess. My mate rejected me for my perfect sister. The rival Alpha King bought me to get revenge. Chapter 1. The Great Mating. The great hall of the Winter Moonpack smelled of cedar, expensive champagne, and the suffocating musk of 300 shifted wolves. For Seraphina, the scent was a physical weight, a reminder of everything she lacked. At 19, she stood in the center of the gilded ballroom, her fingers twisting the silk of her pale blue gown, a dress chosen by her mother to make her look unobtrusive, as if she could simply fade into the wallpaper and spare the family the embarrassment of her presence. In the world of the North, the Great Mating was a sacred night. It was the night the moon blessed the strongest with their fated matches. But for Seraphina, it felt like a funeral. While her peers felt the restless pull of their inner wolves, Seraphina felt only a hollow silence. She was unshifted, a defect, a glitch in a bloodline of purebred alphas. To the Winter Moonpack, she was an omega without the utility of a wolf, a servant in silk. She watched her sister Elara through the crowd. Elara was radiant, her golden hair shimmering under the crystal chandeliers, her scent, sweet jasmine and honey, filling the air like a siren's call. Elara had shifted at 16, a sleek, powerful silver wolf that was the pride of their father, the High Alpha. "Stand up straight, Seraphina," her mother's voice hissed in her ear, sharp as a winter frost. "Try not to look so vacant. If the moon is kind, perhaps a low-ranking beta will see some use in you as a breeder, despite your lack of spirit." Seraphina's skin itched. It was a sensation she'd had since she turned 18, a burning, prickling heat beneath her pores, as if something was trying to claw its way out. But the healers had dismissed it as nerves. Wolfless, they called her. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird when the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung open. A hush fell over the room, so sudden and absolute that the crackle of the fireplace sounded like a thunderclap. Alpha Kael had arrived. He was the future of the Northern Territories, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of molten amber. His scent hit the room a second later, a dominant, aggressive surge of sandalwood and burnt sugar. He was the most powerful alpha of their generation, and he was Seraphina's childhood friend. More than that, he was her hope. They had whispered promises to each other as children, and even as her shift failed to come, Kael had held her hand in the dark, promising that he would claim her regardless. Seraphina's breath hitched as Kael's gaze swept the room. It landed on her. For a heartbeat, the heat beneath her skin flared into a white-hot spark. She felt a tether, a golden thread pulling from her chest toward his. "It's him," she thought, her eyes stinging with tears of relief. "He's my fated mate. The moon hasn't forgotten me." She took a small step forward, her hand reaching out instinctively, her heart singing a song of belonging she had waited her whole life to hear. Chapter 2. The Public Rejection. Kael walked with the predatory grace of a king, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. He didn't stop to acknowledge the elders. He didn't look at the other high-ranking females. His eyes remained locked on Seraphina. She felt the eyes of the entire pack on her. The whispers started, hateful, jealous, confused. Why is he looking at the defective one? Surely he can't mean to claim a wolfless omega. Seraphina ignored them. Her entire world had narrowed down to the man standing 5 feet away. Kael stopped in front of her. The heat between them was palpable, a physical wall of electricity. He looked at her face, tracing the line of her jaw with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Seraphina," he whispered. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in her very marrow. "Kael," she breathed, her voice trembling with the weight of her love. "I felt it. The bond. It's real." Kael's expression didn't soften. Instead, his eyes went cold, the amber turning to a dull, hard yellow. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear. For a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her, to mark her right there in front of the gods and the pack. "I feel it too," Kael whispered, his words a jagged blade. "A fated bond to a broken thing. A match with a girl who can't even grow fur. Do you know what that bond would do to my legacy, Seraphina? It would rot it from the inside out." Seraphina froze. The air left her lungs as if he'd punched her. "Kael, what are you saying?" He pulled back, his face a mask of alpha arrogance. He didn't look at her with love, he looked at her with disgust. He turned his back on her, facing the gathered crowd, his voice booming through the hall. "Members of the Winter Moon Pack! Elders! I, Alpha Kael of the Black Ridge, have searched for my mate tonight. The moon has played a cruel jest, offering me a shell of a woman, a girl without a wolf, a failure of nature." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Seraphina felt her world tilting. Her mother stepped back, distancing herself as if Seraphina were contagious. Kael reached out his hand, but not to Seraphina. He reached past her, grabbing Elara's hand. Elara acted shocked, pressing a delicate hand to her chest, but Seraphina saw the triumphant glint in her sister's eyes. "I reject the bond the moon has cursed me with," Kael shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I reject Seraphina of the Winter Moon. I choose instead a female worthy of an alpha's throne. I claim Elara as my mate by choice, by blood, and by power." The rejection hit Seraphina like a physical blow. In the world of shifters, a fated rejection was more than an insult. It was a soul-shattering trauma. She felt the golden thread in her chest snap, the recoil sending a wave of agonizing cold through her veins. She gasped, falling to her knees on the hard marble floor. No one moved to help her. Not her father, who looked away in shame. Not her mother, who was already smiling at Elara. "You are nothing." Kael looked down at her, his lip curling. "A wolfless omega has no place in a great pack. You are a blemish on our history. Guards, remove this thing from my sight." Chapter 3. The Gilded Cage. The transition from the warmth of the ballroom to the damp, freezing stones of the holding cells was a blur of rough hands and harsh laughter. Seraphina didn't fight. She couldn't. The pain of the snapped bond had left her numb, her mind trapped in a loop of Kael's voice calling her a broken thing. Under the ancient law of the Northern Territories, a rejected omega, especially one who could not shift, became property of the Pack Council. They were seen as a liability, a mouth to feed that provided no protection. The law stated they were to be processed, a polite word for sold to the highest bidder to recoup the cost of their upbringing. Seraphina sat on a thin cot in a cell that smelled of mildew and old iron. The silk of her dress was torn, the hem stained with the filth of the floor. Her wrists were bound in cold iron shackles, suppression cuffs. They were meant to keep a wolf from shifting, but on Seraphina, they felt like a cruel joke. What was there to suppress? Yet the itching was getting worse. Despite the cold, her blood felt like it was boiling. She pressed her forehead against the damp stone wall, a sob finally breaking through her throat. "Why?" she whispered to the empty dark. "Why give me the bond if you weren't going to give me the wolf?" The heavy iron door at the end of the corridor creaked open. The sound of polished boots echoed, the steady, rhythmic pace of someone who owned the ground they walked on. Seraphina didn't look up. She expected the jailer with her final meal before the morning's auction. "Look at you," a voice sneered. Seraphina lifted her head. It was Elara. Her sister stood on the other side of the bars, still wearing her party finery, a velvet cloak thrown over her shoulders. She looked down at Seraphina with a mixture of pity and malice. "You always were the pathetic one," Elara said, her voice smooth as silk. "Did you really think Kael would pick you? An alpha king needs a queen who can hunt by his side, not a pet who cries in the corner. I did you a favor, really. Kael and I have been acquainted for months. He only waited for tonight to make it official." The betrayal cut deeper than the rejection. "You knew," Seraphina whispered. "You knew he was going to do this." "I encouraged it," Elara smiled, reaching through the bars to flick a piece of dirt off Seraphina's shoulder. "Father is already striking your name from the lineage. By tomorrow, you'll be some beta's kitchen maid in the southern wastes, or perhaps a dock worker's toy. Try to be useful, sister. It's the only way you'll survive." Elara turned and swept away, her laughter echoing in the narrow hall. Seraphina curled into a ball on the floor. She closed her eyes, trying to find that golden thread again, but there was only darkness. But deep within that darkness, something else was stirring. It wasn't the soft whimpering of an omega wolf. It was something heavy, something ancient, something that had been sleeping for 1,000 years, waiting for the girl to be broken so the monster could wake up. Chapter 4. The 100 Gold Bid. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It only brought the humiliation of the auction block. Seraphina was led into the town square in chains. A platform had been erected in the shadow of the winter moon sigil. A crowd had gathered, not of the noble wolves she had grown up with, but of the opportunistic, the cruel, and the desperate. Low-level betas from neighboring territories and traveling merchants stood with their purses out, eyeing her like a piece of livestock. The auctioneer, a portly man with a voice like gravel, grabbed Seraphina's chin, forcing her head up for the crowd to see. "Lot number 42, he bellowed. "A female of the winter moon bloodline, prime age for breeding despite the lack of a shift. She's quiet, broken in, and comes from alpha stock. We start the bidding at 10 gold pieces." 12, a man in the front row shouted, his breath smelling of stale ale. He looked at Seraphina with a hunger that made her skin crawl. 15, another cried. 20. Seraphina closed her eyes. She felt the itch beneath her skin turning into a roar. "Let me out," a voice seemed to whisper in the back of her mind. "Let me tear their throats out." The bidding climbed slowly. 25. 30. The men argued over her worth, debating whether her pure blood was worth the risk of her defective nature. Suddenly, the air changed. A cold wind swept through the square, carrying the scent of frozen rain, sharp needles of pine, and a dark, ancient wood, ebony. It was a scent so powerful, so dominant, that it felt like a physical weight pressing the crowd into silence. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The horses picketed nearby began to whinny in terror, and the wolves in the crowd, even the aggressive alphas, lowered their heads instinctively, their tails tucking between their legs. From the back of the square, a path opened. A man strode through the crowd. He was dressed entirely in black, his long coat billowing behind him like wings. He was taller than Kael, his frame broader, his presence so immense that he seemed to swallow the light around him. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and his eyes, they were a piercing, unnatural silver. This was Alpha Silas, the Shadow Alpha, the king of the Forbidden Territories. He was the man mothers used to scare their children into silence. It was said his pack was made of monsters, that he didn't mark his mates, he consumed them. He was Kael's most hated rival, a man who had never lost a border war. Silas stopped at the base of the platform. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked at Seraphina. For the first time since the rejection, the itching under her skin stopped. It turned into a hum of recognition. 100 gold pieces, Silas said. His voice was a deep, resonant velvet that vibrated in Seraphina's chest. The auctioneer gasped, his gavel trembling in his hand. 100? My lord, surely for a wolfless girl. 500, Silas interrupted, his silver eyes never leaving Seraphina's. The square was deathly silent. 500 gold pieces was the price of a fortress, a kingdom. No one dared to outbid him. No one dared to even breathe. Silas stepped onto the platform. The guards scrambled out of his way, nearly tripping over themselves to escape his aura. He walked toward Seraphina, the sound of his boots on the wood sounding like the beating of a drum. He stopped inches from her. He was so close she could feel the cold radiating from his skin. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin up, forcing her to look into the silver storm of his eyes. He didn't look at her with disgust. He didn't look at her with lust. He looked at her as if he were seeing a secret hidden deep within her soul. "You look so small in these chains," Silas whispered, his voice for her ears alone. "They think they've sold me a broken toy." He leaned down, his lips inches from her ear, mirroring the gesture Kael had made the night before. But where Kael's breath had been poison, Silas's was like a shock of adrenaline. "I didn't buy you for your pack, little wolf," he growled, the sound vibrating through her entire body. "I bought you to destroy them. And once I show you what you truly are, you're going to help me burn their world to the ground." Seraphina's heart stopped, then doubled its pace. The chains on her wrists felt lighter, or perhaps she was just becoming stronger. Silas turned to the auctioneer, his hand gripping Seraphina's arm with a possessive, iron grip. "She is mine. Mark the records. If any man from the Winter Moon Pack attempts to touch what belongs to the Shadow King, I will consider it an act of war." He began to lead her off the stage, toward a black carriage waiting at the edge of the square. As they passed the front row, Seraphina saw Kael and Elara standing in the shadows of the great hall, watching with pale faces and wide eyes. Kael's hand was white-knuckled on the hilt of his sword, his amber eyes burning with a mix of rage and a sudden, flickering doubt. Silas didn't even glance at them. He pushed Seraphina into the carriage and climbed in after her, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the silent square. The Border and the Awakening. Chapter 5. The Carriage Ride. The interior of Alpha Silas's carriage was a world of dark velvet and polished mahogany, smelling of expensive tobacco and the cold, sharp scent of Silas himself, ebony and frozen rain. It was a stark contrast to the filth of the holding cell Seraphina had occupied just an hour before. She sat huddled against the door, her fingers digging into the plush seat. Across from her, Silas sat with effortless grace, his long legs stretched out, his silver eyes fixed on her with a predatory stillness. He hadn't spoken since they left the square. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the creaking of the carriage springs. Seraphina felt the weight of her silence. In the Winter Moon Pack, she was taught to be invisible, to keep her head down lest she remind the alphas of her failure. But Silas's gaze felt like a physical touch, a heat that crawled over her skin, making the itching beneath her pores flare into a dull ache. "You're shaking," Silas said finally. His voice was low, vibrating through the small space. "I've just been sold like a horse, my lord," Seraphina replied, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain stoic. "I believe I'm entitled to a little tremors." Silas leaned forward, the movement slow and deliberate. The air in the carriage seemed to vanish, replaced by his overwhelming presence. He reached out, and for a terrifying second, Seraphina thought he was going to strike her. Instead, his fingers brushed against the iron suppression cuffs still locked around her wrists. "These are useless on you," he murmured. "Why did they put them on a girl with no wolf?" "To humiliate me," she whispered, to remind me that even if I had a soul, it would be a prisoner. Silas's thumb traced the line of the iron, and Seraphina gasped. Where he touched her, the itching turned into a searing flash of lightning. A spark jumped between his skin and the metal, a blue, ethereal light that flickered and died. Silas froze. His silver eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide until they were nearly black. He didn't pull away. If anything, he pressed closer, his scent flooding her senses. Interesting, he breathed. Your pack called you defective. They called you a null. But a null doesn't bleed power into iron, Seraphina. I don't have power, she insisted, her heart racing. I'm an omega, a mistake. Kael was the mistake, Silas growled, the name of his rival tasting like poison on his tongue. He looked at a diamond and complained that it wasn't a piece of coal. He wanted a wolf he could command. He was too weak to realize that you aren't something to be commanded. Seraphina looked up, meeting his gaze. Then why did you buy me? If not for revenge against him, then for what? To be your concubine? To be a trophy in your hall? Silas's lips curved into a thin, dangerous smile. I don't need trophies. I need a queen who can survive the shadows of my kingdom. And I suspect, little wolf, that you have more shadow in you than even I do. He sat back, but the tension didn't leave. It hung between them, thick and suffocating. Seraphina looked out the window as the landscape began to change. The rolling green hills of the winter moon territory were fading, replaced by jagged gray cliffs and ancient, twisted forests. They were approaching the border, the veil between the known world and the Shadowlands. Chapter 6. Crossing the Border. As the carriage reached the mountain pass that marked the edge of Silas's territory, the atmosphere shifted. The light took on a violet hue, and the very air felt thicker, charged with an ancient, restless magic. Seraphina let out a low moan, clutching her stomach. The itching was no longer a nuisance, it was an inferno. It felt as if her blood had been replaced by molten silver, bubbling and boiling beneath her skin. What is this? She gasped, her vision blurring. Silas was at her side in an instant. He didn't pull her into his lap, but he braced her shoulders, his touch the only thing keeping her from collapsing onto the floor. My lands are old, Seraphina. They don't recognize the laws of the central pacts. Here, the earth speaks to the blood. It calls to what is hidden. It hurts, she choked out. She felt her bones begin to hum, a vibration that started in her spine and radiated outward to her fingertips. Don't fight it, Silas commanded, his voice pressing into her mind. The winter moons suppressed you. They used their collective will to keep you small, to keep your wolf locked in a cage of shame. But you're in my world now, and in the shadows, everything grows. Seraphina screamed as a sharp, agonizing crack echoed through the carriage. It sounded like a dry branch snapping, but she knew it was her own ribs shifting. Her skin felt too tight, a prison of flesh that was being pushed to its breaking point. The carriage lurched to a sudden, violent halt. Outside, the horses screamed in terror. The sound of snarling and the clashing of steel erupted from the darkness. Stay here, Silas hissed. His eyes were glowing gold now, the shift of the alpha taking over his features. His canines lengthened, and his fingernails sharpened into claws. Silas, wait! Seraphina reached for him, but he was already gone, disappearing through the carriage door into the chaotic night. Seraphina slumped against the seat, her body convulsing. Through the window, she saw the shapes of massive, mangy wolves. Rogues. They were the outcasts of the world, driven mad by bloodlust and exile. There were dozens of them, emerging from the mist like ghosts. Silas was a whirlwind of violence. He didn't even fully shift. He fought in a half-state, a nightmare of muscle and teeth. He tore through the rogues with a terrifying efficiency, but there were too many. They weren't just attacking. They were a coordinated wave, sent to intercept the Shadow King before he reached his fortress. One rogue, A massive beast with a scarred eye circled around the carriage. It caught Seraphina's scent, or lack thereof, and lunged. The glass shattered inward as the wolf's head burst through the window, snapping at her throat. Seraphina scrambled back, her fear finally reaching a breaking point. But as the wolf's hot, rancid breath hit her face, the fear didn't turn into paralysis. It turned into a white-hot, blinding rage. "How dare they?" a voice roared in her head, a voice that wasn't hers. "How dare they hunt us? How dare they touch what is ours?" The pain in her bones vanished, replaced by a surge of power so immense it felt like the sun was exploding inside her chest. Chapter 7. The dire wolf emerges. The carriage didn't just break, it exploded. The wood splintered into 1,000 shards as something massive expanded from within. The rogue that had been snapping at Seraphina was tossed aside like a rag doll. Its neck snapped before it even hit the ground. Silas, covered in the blood of his enemies, turned back, his amber eyes widening in shock. In the center of the wreckage stood a creature of legend. She was not the small, lithe wolf of an omega. She was not even the size of a standard alpha. She stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder, her fur the color of a blinding, pristine blizzard. Her eyes were not amber or gold, but a terrifying, glowing sapphire blue. This was a white direwolf, the ancestral mother of all shifters, a creature thought to have gone extinct before the first kings were crowned. The remaining rogues froze. The primitive instinct that drove them to kill was suddenly overwritten by a much older instinct, the need to kneel. One by one, the snarling beasts whimpered, their bellies hitting the dirt as they cowered before the moon-white goddess. Seraphina, or the spirit that now inhabited her, didn't hesitate. She didn't run. She moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics, a blur of white light. With a single swipe of a paw the size of a man's chest, she decapitated the nearest rogue. She didn't hunt, she cleansed. Every snap of her jaws sounded like a thunderclap. The air around her seemed to shimmer with a cold blue frost. In less than a minute, the clearing was silent, save for the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the great wolf. Silas stood amidst the carnage, his own wolf form receding as he watched her. He was an alpha king, a man who feared nothing, but as the white direwolf turned her sapphire gaze toward him, he felt a primal shiver run down his spine. She took a step toward him, her massive paws silent on the frozen earth. She was beautiful and terrifying, a prehistoric force of nature. She lowered her head, her snout inches from his chest. Silas didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He slowly raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he buried them in the thick, soft fur of her neck. "Seraphina," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and something that sounded dangerously like worship. The great wolf let out a low, vibrating hum that shook the very ground. Then, the blue light began to fade. The massive form started to shrink, the bones clicking and sliding back into a human shape. Silas caught her before she hit the dirt. Seraphina was human again, her skin pale and shimmering with a faint silver sweat. She was unconscious, her head lolling against his shoulder, but the air around her still crackled with the remnants of her transformation. Silas looked down at the girl the winter moonpack had thrown away. He looked at the carnage she had wrought, and then he looked toward the horizon, where the spires of his dark fortress rose against the moon. "They thought you were a broken omega," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous promise to the wind. He pulled his cloak around her, shielding her from the cold. "They thought they could sell the soul of the world for a handful of gold." He stood up, carrying her with a terrifyingly possessive grip. "Let them come for you," he growled. "Let Kael realize what he threw away. I will burn every pack, every city, and every throne in this world before I let them take you back." He began to walk toward the fortress, leaving the bodies of the rogues for the crows. In the distance, a lone wolf howled. Not a challenge, but a salute. The Queen of the North had returned, And the Shadow King was the only one who knew that the world was about to change forever. Chapter 8. The Queen's Chambers. Seraphina drifted back to consciousness through a haze of lavender and expensive soap. The first thing she noticed was the silence, a deep, heavy silence that felt like velvet. There was no barking of distant hounds, no shouting of guards, no cold wind whistling through a stone cell. She opened her eyes and gasped. She wasn't on a floor. She was submerged in a bed so soft it felt like a cloud. The sheets were black silk, cool against her skin, and the room around her was a masterpiece of obsidian and gold. Large floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a jagged mountain range, shrouded in permanent mist. She sat up, clutching the duvet to her chest. She was wearing a gown of sheer gossamer lace that she didn't recognize. Her wrists were bare. The iron suppression cuffs were gone, replaced by faint, reddish marks that were already beginning to heal. "You've been asleep for 2 days." Seraphina jumped. Silas was sitting in a high-backed armchair in the corner of the room. He wasn't wearing his heavy traveling cloak. He was in a simple black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with silver tattoos. He looked less like a monster and more like a king at rest, yet the air around him still hummed with that terrifying alpha authority. 2 days? Seraphina's voice was raspy. The wolf, the white wolf. Was that a dream? It was a memory, Silas said, standing and walking toward the bed. He moved with a silent, predatory grace. A memory of a power your people tried to smother. How do you feel? Seraphina searched her internal landscape. The hollow, empty ache that had defined her entire life, the null sensation, was gone. In its place was a low, constant thrum of energy, like a subterranean river. But there was something else, a connection. She looked at Silas and felt a sudden wave of calm. It wasn't her own calm, it was his. She could feel his steady heartbeat, his quiet confidence, and a strange, flickering heat that surged when he looked at her. "I can feel you," she whispered, her eyes wide. "The bond. I thought it was broken when Kael rejected me." "Kael rejected a shadow," Silas said, stopping at the edge of the bed. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The scent of frozen rain was intoxicating. "The bond he had with you was a surface-level thing, a biological fluke. What you feel now, that is the shadow bond. It doesn't bind your body, Seraphina. It binds your soul." He reached out, his thumb grazing her lower lip. Seraphina's breath hitched. In the winter moon pack, she was a defect. Here, under Silas's gaze, she felt like the sun. "I brought you here to be safe," he said softly. "But my people are whispering. They saw the dire wolf. They know I didn't buy a maid. They know I brought home a goddess." Chapter 9. Training the Beast. The next few days were a blur of intense discovery. Silas didn't treat Seraphina as a prisoner. He treated her as a partner in a dangerous game. He took her to a secluded courtyard at the highest point of the fortress, surrounded by jagged peaks and the swirling purple mist of the Shadowlands. "The white wolf is a creature of instinct and rage," Silas explained, standing behind her, his hands guiding her posture. The physical contact was electric. His chest was a wall of heat against her back. "To lead, you must control the shift. You must be the one who opens the door, not the one who is pushed through it." "It feels like a storm inside me," Seraphina said, her eyes closed. She was trying to reach for that sapphire light she had felt on the border. "If I let it out, I'm afraid I'll lose myself again." "You won't," Silas whispered into her ear, his breath sending shivers down her spine. "Because I am the anchor. Look into the dark, Seraphina. Don't look for the wolf. Look for the queen." He turned her around, his hands gripping her waist. His eyes were a burning silver. "Do you know why I really bought you?" Seraphina shook her head, unable to speak. "The null haze. The reason no one could smell your wolf. It wasn't because you were broken, Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. It was because your power was so vast it was folding in on itself, like a black hole. I am a shadow alpha. I spend my life looking into the voids of the world. The moment I saw you on that stage, I didn't see a girl. I saw a universe. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, the world stopped. Seraphina felt the raw honesty in him, the loneliness of a king who had waited centuries for an equal. She reached up, her fingers trembling as she touched the silver tattoos on his neck. The air around them began to crackle. The blue frost started to form on the stone floor. "Again," Silas commanded, his voice a low growl of encouragement. "Show me." With a cry that was half sob and half roar, Seraphina let the power go. This time, it wasn't a violent explosion. It was a fluid, majestic transformation. Her body elongated, her skin erupting into moon-white fur. Silas didn't back away. He stood his ground as the 7-foot direwolf materialized before him. She nudged his chest with her massive head, her sapphire eyes filled with a terrifying intelligence. Silas laughed, a rare, beautiful sound, and buried his face in her fur. "Magnificent," he breathed. But the moment of triumph was shattered by the sound of a horn blowing at the fortress gates. It was a sharp, discordant tone, the signal for an unwanted messenger. Chapter 10. The Messenger. Seraphina shifted back, Silas quickly draping his cloak over her shivering form. They descended to the great hall, where a group of riders stood. They wore the silver and blue tabards of the Winter Moon Pack. At their head stood a young beta Seraphina recognized, Kael's most loyal lieutenant. He looked around the obsidian hall with a mixture of fear and arrogance. When his eyes landed on Seraphina, his jaw dropped. She was no longer the bedraggled girl in the torn silk dress. She was standing beside the Shadow King, wrapped in his furs, her hair a wild halo of silver white, her eyes glowing with a lingering blue fire. "Speak," Silas commanded, his voice echoing like thunder. He sat on his throne of jagged glass, drawing Seraphina to stand beside him. He didn't just place a hand on her shoulder. He gripped her with a possessive, territorial claim. The messenger swallowed hard. "Alpha Kael. He sends his greetings to the Shadow King. He acknowledges the sale of the Omega, Seraphina. However, there has been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Seraphina spoke, her voice clear and cold. It was the first time she had ever addressed a member of her old pack with anything but submissiveness. The messenger flinched. "The High Elders have reviewed the scrolls. The rejection of a fated mate. It was done under duress. Alpha Kael has realized his mistake. He has sent me to return the 500 gold pieces, doubled, to void the sale. He demands the return of his mate, the future Luna of the Winter Moon." Silas's growl started deep in his chest, a sound so primal it made the stones of the hall vibrate. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and writhe, as if they were alive. "He demands?" Silas said, his voice a lethal whisper. "He stood on a stage and called her a thing. He let his guards throw her into a cage. He watched as she was sold to the highest bidder." "He didn't know what she was," the messenger cried out, his desperation showing. "He has seen the reports from the border. He knows she is the White Wolf. She belongs to the north. She belongs to Kael." "I belong to no one." Seraphina stepped forward, the blue light flickering in her palms. "Tell Kael that he didn't reject a wolf. He rejected a soul, and that soul has found a new home." Silas stood up, his presence filling the room until the messengers were forced to their knees by the sheer weight of his aura. "Return to your master," Silas said, his silver eyes flashing with a murderous light. "Tell him that Seraphina is no longer a daughter of the Winter Moon. She is the Shadow Queen. If Kael wants her, tell him to come and take her. But warn him, the last thing he will see before I tear out his throat is the White Wolf smiling at his corpse." The messengers didn't wait. They scrambled out of the hall, their horses' hooves clattering in a panicked retreat. The hall fell silent. Seraphina turned to Silas, her heart hammering. He won't stop, Silas. Kael is vain. He won't just let me go, especially not now that he knows I have the power he craves. Silas turned to her, his expression unreadable. He walked to her, his movements slow and deliberate, until he had her backed against the cold obsidian wall. He placed his hands on either side of her head, pinning her in place. "He's coming," Silas whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. "He's coming to reclaim his property. He thinks the bond he threw away still gives him a right to your skin." He leaned in closer, his scent of frozen rain and ebony wrapping around her like a shroud. "He had his chance to mark you, Seraphina. He had his chance to be your world. He failed." Silas's voice was a low, hungry rasp. "Now it's my turn. I didn't just buy your freedom. I want all of you. Every shadow, every light, every roar." He tilted her chin up, his silver eyes searching hers. "Are you willing, Seraphina? Are you ready to let the world know who you truly belong to?" Seraphina looked into the eyes of the man who had seen her when she was invisible, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a broken thing. She felt like a storm. She reached up, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him down. "Mark me," she whispered, "and let them try to take me back." Chapter 11. The Invasion. The sky over the Shadowlands had turned the color of a fresh bruise. Deep purples and jagged grays, clashing as a supernatural storm rolled in from the north. It wasn't just weather. It was the herald of an army. Seraphina stood on the highest battlement of Silas's fortress, her white hair whipping around her face like a shroud. Below, the mountain pass was choked with the silver and blue banners of the Winter Moon Pack. Kael had not come alone. He had brought the full weight of his lineage, 1,000 wolves, driven by his bruised ego and his sudden frantic greed for the power he had so foolishly discarded. "He looks so small from up here," Seraphina whispered. Silas stepped up behind her, his presence a warm, solid weight against her back. He wore his heavy combat armor, black leather reinforced with enchanted steel. His scent, ebony and frozen rain, was sharp with anticipation. A man who defines himself by what he owns will always be small, Seraphina. He doesn't want you. He wants the legend you carry in your blood. "Then let's give him the legend," she said, her voice dropping into a register that made the air around them vibrate. The gates of the fortress groaned as the first wave of Winter Moon warriors slammed into them. But Kael didn't wait for a siege. He used his alpha roar, a sound designed to cow lesser wolves into submission. It echoed up the cliffs, a demand for surrender that made the Shadow Pack guards flinch. Then, a smaller figure emerged from the front lines. Elara. She looked out of place on a battlefield, her golden hair perfectly coiffed, wearing an armored corset that looked more like jewelry than protection. She stepped forward, her voice amplified by a beta's channeling stone. "Seraphina!" Elara screamed, her voice shrill with a mixture of terror and jealousy. "Come down and face your family. You've been brainwashed by this monster. Kael is merciful. He is willing to forgive your betrayal. Come back to the light before we burn this den of shadows to the ground." Seraphina looked down at her sister. For years, Elara had been the sun around which Seraphina's world revolved. Now, Elara looked like a flickering candle, desperate and dim. "I am not a child playing in your garden anymore, Elara." Seraphina's voice didn't need a stone to carry. It resonated from her chest, deep and resonant. "And there is no light in a pack that sells its daughters. If you want me, come and take me. But be warned, the shadows here have teeth." With a flick of her hand, Seraphina signaled the defense. The Shadow Pack didn't howl. They moved like ghosts, dropping from the cliffs in a silent, lethal rain of fur and steel. The battle had begun. Chapter 12. Battle of the Alphas. The courtyard of the fortress became a slaughterhouse of snow and blood. Seraphina watched from the ramparts as Silas leaped from the wall, shifting mid-air into a massive black wolf with silver eyes. He landed in the center of the winter moon line, a whirlwind of destruction. Kael was waiting for him. Kael shifted into his own form, a powerful, amber-eyed golden wolf. The two alphas collided with a sound like a mountain collapsing. It wasn't just a physical fight, it was a clash of wills. The air around them ionized, smelling of ozone and burnt sugar. Seraphina began to descend the stone stairs, her heart hammering. She saw Elara cowering behind a pillar, watching the fight with wide, terrified eyes. As Seraphina approached, Elara pulled a small, wicked-looking dagger from her belt. "You ruined everything," Elara hissed, lunging forward. "I was supposed to be the queen. I was the perfect one." Seraphina didn't even shift. She caught Elara's wrist with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The blue light flared in her eyes. "You were a puppet, Elara, and I am done being the stage." She twisted the dagger out of Elara's hand and pushed her back. "Go home. If you survive this night, tell our father that the winter moon has set. The night belongs to me." But a scream of agony from the center of the courtyard drew Seraphina's attention away. Kael had cheated. In his human form, he had pulled a concealed blade, a long, thin spike of pure, refined silver. He had driven it deep into Silas's shoulder while Silas was pinned beneath him. The Shadow King let out a guttural roar of pain, his shift breaking as the silver poisoned his blood. He collapsed onto the stones, his skin turning a sickly gray. Kael stood over him, his face contorted with a manic, triumphant grin. "Did you think I would fight fair with a mongrel like you?" Kael spat, raising the silver blade for a killing blow. "She is my mate, my property, and I will take her back over your cold, dead heart." "No," Seraphina whispered. The word started as a breath, but it ended as a roar that shattered the windows of the great hall. The world seemed to slow down. Seraphina didn't just shift, she exploded. The white light was so bright it blinded every wolf in the courtyard. The white dire wolf didn't just appear, she manifested as if she were stepping out of a dream. She was larger than she had been at the border, 10 feet tall, a mountain of moon-white fur and sapphire fire. She lunged. She didn't bite Kael. She simply slammed her massive paw into his chest, sending him flying across the courtyard like a broken doll. He hit the stone wall with a sickening crunch, the silver blade clattering harmlessly away. The direwolf stood over the fallen Silas, her massive body a shield. She looked out at the two packs, at the hundreds of wolves frozen in mid-fight. "Kneel!" The word wasn't spoken, it was projected. It was the alpha command of the First Mother. Every wolf in the Winter Moon pack and every wolf in the Shadow pack felt their legs give way. Their instincts overrode their loyalty, their fear, and their greed. One, by the hundreds, they hit the dirt, their heads bowed in absolute, terrifying submission. Kael tried to stand, coughing up blood, his eyes wide with a realization that came too late. "Seraphina, please, the bond!" The direwolf looked down at him, her sapphire eyes filled with an ancient, cold pity. She shifted back into her human form, standing naked and unashamed in the center of the kneeling army. She walked to Silas, who was struggling to breathe, the silver still burning in his veins.
Chapter 13. The True Marking.
Seraphina knelt beside Silas. She didn't look at the army. She didn't look at Kael. She reached for the silver spike buried in Silas's shoulder. "It will burn you," Silas wheezed, his hand feebly trying to push her away. "Seraphina, don't." "I am the white wolf, Silas," she whispered, her voice a calm melody amidst the chaos. "The silver cannot touch what the moon has blessed." She gripped the hilt of the blade. As her skin touched the metal, it began to glow blue. The silver didn't burn her, it melted. It turned into a liquid, harmless mercury that flowed out of Silas's wound and evaporated into the air. Silas gasped, his color returning instantly. The poison was gone, his alpha healing factor kicking in with a roar. He sat up, his eyes locking onto hers. "You saved me," he breathed. "I claimed you," she corrected. She turned her head, looking at Kael, who was watching them from the dirt. "You spoke of a bond, Kael. You spoke of the moon's gift. But you forgot one thing. The moon doesn't just give, she tests. You failed your test the moment you valued a wolf's coat more than a woman's soul." She felt a pull in her chest, not the thin, fragile golden thread she had felt with Kael, but a heavy, unbreakable chain of silver and shadow. It linked her to Silas. It had been there since the moment he bought her, growing stronger with every touch, every word, every shared look. "The bond between us was a lie," Seraphina said, her voice carrying to every ear in the courtyard. "A false match meant to lead me to my true king. I reject you, Kael of the winter moon, not because you are weak, but because you are nothing." Kael let out a sob, the final snap of the false bond shattering what was left of his mind. He was no longer an alpha, he was a broken man. Silas stood up, his hand finding Seraphina's waist. He looked out at the combined packs. "The winter moon pack is no more," Silas declared. "From this day forward, you are the United Territories. You serve the White Queen, and if any man questions her rule—" He looked down at Seraphina, his eyes softening into a look of pure, unadulterated devotion. "They answer to the Shadow King." He turned Seraphina in his arms. The air grew heavy with the scent of ebony and frozen rain, mixed now with the scent of fresh snow and ozone that radiated from her. "It's time," Silas whispered. He didn't wait for a ceremony. He leaned down, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin at the junction of her neck and shoulder. Seraphina arched her back, her hands gripping his hair. As his fangs sank into her skin, she didn't feel pain. She felt a surge of absolute completion. The shadow bond flared into a blinding light, searing his mark into her soul. She felt his thoughts, his memories, his undying love for the girl who had been sold for 500 gold pieces. She leaned in, her own teeth baring as she bit him in return, her mark appearing on his neck in a flash of sapphire light. The two packs let out a simultaneous howl, not of war, but of a new era. Seraphina looked up at the bruised sky. The storm was over. The moon was beginning to peek through the clouds, full and silver. She was no longer a rejected Omega. She was no longer a perfect sister's shadow. She was the Queen of the North, and her reign was only just beginning.